Chapter 6. Tobias Gregson shows what he can do. The papers next day were full of the Brixton mystery, as they termed it. Each had a long account of the affair, and some had leaders upon it in addition. There was some information in them which was new to me. I still retain in my scrapbook numerous clippings and extracts bearing upon the case. Here is a condensation of a few of them. The Daily Telegraph remarked that in the history of crime there had seldom been a tragedy which presented stranger features. A German name of the victim, the absence of all another motive, and a sinister inscription upon the wall, all pointed to its penetration by political refugees and revolutionists. The Socialists had many branches in America, and had no doubt infringed their unwritten laws and been tracked down by them. After alluding airily to the Vengeric, Aqua Tofana, Carbonari, and the Mountiansons of Brinvilliers, the Darwinian theory and principles of Malthus, and the Ratcliffe Highway murders, the article concluded by admonishing the government and advocating a closer watch over foreigners in England. The Standard commented upon the fact that the lawless outrages of the sort of usually occurred under a liberal administration. They arose from the unsettling of the minds of the masses and the consequent weakening of all authority. The deceased was an American gentleman who had been residing for some weeks in the metropolis. He had stayed in the boarding house of Madame Carpentier and Torquay Terence Camberwell. He was accompanied by his travels with his private secretary, Mr. Joseph Strangerson. The two bade adieu to the landlady upon Tuesday, the 4th, instead, and departed to Euston Station, which was with avowed intention of catching the Liverpool express. They were afterwards seen together upon the platform. Nothing more is known of them until Mr. Drebber's body was, as recorded, discovered in an empty house in the Brixton Road, many miles from Euston. How he came there, or how he met his fate, are questions which are still involved in mystery. Nothing is more of the whereabouts of Strangerson. We are glad to learn that Mr. Lestrade and Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard are both engaged upon the case, and it is confidently anticipated that these well-known officers will speedily throw light upon the matter. The Daily News observed that there was no doubt as to the crime being a political one. The despotism and hatred of liberalism which animated the continental governments had had the effect of driving to our shores a number of men who might have made excellent citizens were they not soured by the recollection of all they had undergone. Among these men were a stringent code of honor, any infringement of which was punished by death. Every effort should be made to find the secretary, Strangerson, and to ascertain the particulars of the habits of the deceased. A great step had been gained by the discovery of the address of the house at which he had boarded, a result which was entirely due to the acuteness and energy of Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard. Sherlock Holmes and I read these notices over together at breakfast, and they appeared to afford him considerable amusement. I told you that, whatever happened, Lestrade and Gregson would be sure to score. That depends on how it turns out. Oh, bless you. It doesn't matter in the least. If the man is caught, it will be on account of extortions. If he escapes, it will be in spite of their exertions. It's heads I win, tails you lose. Whatever they do, they will have followers. On sort throve trudro on pos, sort que lambia. What on earth is that? I cried. At this moment there was a pattering of many steps in the hall, and on the stairs, accompanied by audible expressions of disgust upon the part of our landlady. It's the Baker Street division of the police detective force, said my companion gravely, and as he spoke there rushed into the room half a dozen of the dirtiest and most ragged street Arabs that ever clapped eyes on. "Attention!" cried Holmes in a sharp tone, and the 6 little dirty scoundrels stood in line like so many disreputable statues. In future, you shall wind up Wiggins alone to report. The rest of you will wait in the street. What have you found out, Wiggins? Oh, sir, we haven't, said one of the youths. I hardly expected you would. You must keep on until you do. Here are your wages. He handed each of them a shilling. Now, off you go, and come back with a better report next time. He waved his hand, and they scampered downstairs like so many rats, and we heard their shrill voices next moment in the street. There's more work to be got out of one of those little beggars than there are a dozen of the force, Holmes remarked. The mere sight of an official-looking person seals men's lips. These youngsters, however, go everywhere and hear everything. They're as sharp as needles, too. All they want is organization. Is it the Gregson case that you're employing them? I asked. Yes, there is a point which I wish to ascertain. It is merely a matter of time. Hello, we are going to hear some news now with a vengeance. Here is Gregson coming down the road with a beatitude written upon every feature of his face. Bound for us, I know. Yes, he is stopping. There he is. There was a violent peal at the bell, and in a few minutes a fair-haired detective came up the stairs, 3 steps at a time, and burst into our sitting room. My dear fellow, cried Holmes, wringing his hands, congratulate me. I have made the whole thing as clear as day. A shade of anxiety seemed to me to cross my companion's expressive face. Do you mean that you are on the right track? He asked. The right track? Why, sir, we have the man under lock and key. And his name is? Arthur Charpenter, sub-lieutenant of Her Majesty's Navy, cried Gregson pompously, rubbing his fat hands and inflating his chest. Sherlock Holmes gave a sigh of relief and relaxed into a smile. Take a seat and try one of these cigars, he said. We are anxious to know how you manage it. Will you have some whiskey and water? Don't mind if I do, the detective answered. The tremendous exertions which I have gone through during the last day or two has worn me out. Not so much bodily exertion, you understand, as a strain upon the mind. You will appreciate that, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, for we are both brain workers. You do me too much honor, said Holmes gravely. Let us hear how you arrived at this most gratifying result. The detective seated himself in the armchair and puffed complacently at his cigar. Then suddenly he slapped his thigh in a paroxysm of amusement. The fun of it is, he cried, that fool Lestrade, who thinks himself so smart, had gone off upon the wrong track altogether. He is after the Secretary Stangerson, who had no more to do than the crime than a babe unborn. I have no doubt that he has caught him by this time. This idea tickled Gregson so much that he laughed until he choked. And how did you get your clue? I'll tell you all about it, of course, Dr. Watson. This is strictly between ourselves. The first difficulty which we had to contend was at the finding this American's acid essence. Some people would have waited until their advertisements were answered, or until parties came forward and volunteered information. That is not Tobias Gregson's way of doing work. You remember the hat beside the dead man? Yes, said Holmes. By John Underwood and Sons, 129 Camberwell Road. Gregson was crestfallen. I had no idea you had noticed that, he said. Have you been there? No. Ha, said Gregson in a relieved voice. You should never neglect a chance, however small it may seem. To a great mind, nothing is little, remarked Holmes sententiously. Well, I went to Underwood and asked him if he had sold a hat that size and description. He looked over his books and came upon it at once. He had sent the hat to a Mr. Drebber, correspondent to Charpenter's boarding establishment, Troquet Terrace, and thus I got the address. Smart. Very smart, murmured Sherlock Holmes. I next called upon Madame Charpentier, continued the detective. I found her very pale and distressed. Her daughter was in the room, too. An uncommonly fine girl she is. Too, she was looking red about the eyes, and her lips trembled as I spoke to her. They didn't escape my notice. I began to smell a rat. You know that feeling, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, when you come upon the right scent, a kind of thrill in your nerves? Have you heard of the mysterious death of your late borrower, Mr. Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland? I asked. The mother nodded. She seemed able to get out a word. The daughter burst into tears. I felt more than ever that these people knew something of the matter. At what o'clock did Mr. Drebber leave your house for the train? I asked. At 8 o'clock, she said, gulping in her throat to keep down her agitation. Your secretary, Mr. Stagerson, said that there were 2 trains, one 9:15 and one at 11. He was to catch the first. And what was that last which you saw him? A terrible change came across the woman's face as I asked that question. Her features turned perfectly livid. It was some seconds before she could get out a single word. Yes. And when it did come out, it was in a husky, unnatural tone. There was a silence for a moment, then the daughter spoke in a calm, clear voice. No good can come over the falsehood, Mother, she said. Let us be frank with the gentleman. We did see Mr. Drebber again. God forgive you, cried Madame Charpentier, throwing up her hands and sinking back in the chair. You have murdered your brother. Arthur would have that we spoke the truth, the girl answered firmly. You had best tell me all about it now, I said. Half confidences are the worst of none. Besides, you do not know half how much you know of it. Yeah. Oh, on your head be it, Alice, cried her mother, and then turning to me. I will tell you all, sir. Do not imagine that my agitation on behalf of my son arises from any fear lest he should have a hand in this terrible affair. He is utterly innocent of it. My dread is, however, that in your eyes and in the eyes of others he may appear to be compromised. That, however, is surely impossible. His high character and his profession, his antecedents, all forbid it. Your best way is to make clean breast of the facts, I answered. Depend on it. If your son is innocent, he will be none for the worse. Perhaps, Alice, you had better leave us together, she said, and the daughter withdrew. Now, sir, she continued, I had no intention of telling you all this, but since my poor daughter has disclosed it, I have no alternative. Having once decided to speak, I will tell you all without omitting any particular. It is your wisest choice, of course, I said. Mr. Drebber has been with us nearly 3 weeks. He and his secretary, Mr. Stagerson, have been traveling on the continent. I noticed Copenhagen label upon each of the trunks, showing that they had been their last stopping place. Stagerson was a quiet, reserved man, and his employer, I am sorry to say, was far otherwise. He was, of course, in his habits and brutish in his ways. The very night of his arrival he became very much the worse for drink, and, indeed, after 12 o'clock in the day he could hardly ever be said to be sober. His manners towards the maidservants were disgustingly free and familiar. Worst of all, he speedily assumed the same attitude towards my daughter Alice, and spoke to her more than once, in which way, fortunately, she is too innocent to understand. On one occasion he actually seized her by the arms and embraced her, an outrage which caused his own secretary to reproach him from his unmanly conduct. But why did you stand for all this? I asked. I suppose that we can get rid of your boarders when you wish. Madame Charpentier blushed at my pertinent question. Would to God that I had given him notice that very day that he came, she said. But it was a sore temptation. They were paying £1 a day each, £14 a week. And this is the slack season, and I am a widow, and my boy in the Navy has cost me much. I grudged to lose the money. I acted for the best. This last was too much, however, and I gave him notice to leave on account of it. That was the reason of his going. Well, my heart grew light when I saw him drive away. My son is on leave just now, but I did not tell him anything of this, for his temper is violent. He is passionately fond of his sister. When I closed the door behind them, a load seemed to be lifted from my mind. Alas, in less than an hour he was at the bell ringing. I learned that Mr. Drebber had returned. He was much excited and evidently the worse for drink. He forced his way into the room and where I was sitting with my daughter, and he made some incoherent remark about having missed the train. Then he turned to Alice and before my very face proposed to her that she should fly with him. You are of age, he said, and there is no law to stop you. I have enough money to spare. Never mind the old girl here. Come along with me straight away. You shall live like a princess. Poor Alice was so frightened that she shrunk away from him, and he caught her by the wrist and endeavored to draw her towards the door. I screamed, and at the moment my son Arthur came into the room. What happened then I do not know. I heard oaths and confused sounds of a scuffle. I was too terrified to raise my head, and then I looked up and saw Arthur standing in the doorway laughing with a stick in his hand. I don't think that fine fellow will trouble us again, he said. I'll just go after him and see what he does with himself. With those words he took his hat and started off down the street. The next morning we heard about Mr. Drebber's mysterious death. The statement came from Madame Charpenter's lips with many gasps and pauses, and at times she spoke so low that I could hardly catch her words. I made shorthand notes of all that she said, however, so that there should be no possibility of mistake. It's quite exciting, said Sherlock Holmes with a yawn. What happened next? When Madame Charpenter paused, the detective continued, I saw that the whole case hung upon one point. Fixing her with an eye on which way I could always find it effective with women, I asked her at what hour her son returned. I do not know, she answered. Not know? No, he has a latchkey and let himself in. After you went to bed? Yes. When did you go to bed? About 11. And your son was gone at least 2 hours? Yes. Possibly 4 or 5? Yes. What was he doing during that time? I do not know, she answered, turning white to her very lips. Of course, after that, there was nothing more to be done. I found out where Lieutenant Charpenter was, took 2 officers with me, and arrested him. When I touched him on the shoulder and warned him to come quietly with us, he answered to us as bold as brass. I suppose you arrested me for that concerning to the death of the scoundrel Drebber, he said. We had nothing to him about it, so, with his alluding to it, had the most suspicious count. Very, said Holmes. Still, he carried the heavy stick which his mother described as us to having with him, and he followed Drebber. It was a stout oak cudgel. What is your theory, then? Well, my theory is that he followed Drebber as far as the Gregson road. From there, a fresh altercation arose between them, and he struck which Drebber received a blow from the stick, and in the pit of the stomach, perhaps, which killed him without leaving any mark. The night was so wet that no one thought it was about, and so Charpenter dragged the body of the victim into the empty house. As to the candle and the blood and the writing on the wall and the ring, there may be so many tricks to throw the police off to the wrong scent. Well done, said Holmes in an encouraging voice. Really, Gregson, you are getting along. We shall make something of you yet. I flatter myself that I have managed it rather neatly, the detective answered proudly. The young man volunteered a statement in which he said that the following Drebber some time later perceived him and took a cab in order to get away from him. On his way home he met an old shipmate and took a long walk with him. On being asked where his shipmate lived, he was unable to give a satisfactory reply. I think the whole case fits together uncommonly well. It amuses me to think that Lestrade, who was starting off on the wrong scent, I'm afraid he won't make much of it. Why, by Jove, here's the very man himself. It was indeed Lestrade who had ascended the stairs while we were talking, and who now entered the room. The assurance and the jauntiness which generally marked his demeanor and dress were, however, wanting. His face was disturbed and troubled, while his clothes were disarranged and untidy. He had evidently come in with the intention of consulting with Sherlock Holmes, for on perceiving his colleague he appeared to be embarrassed and put out. He stood in the center of the room, fumbling nervously about with his hat, and uncertain what to do. "This is a most extraordinary case," he said at last. "A most incomprehensible affair." "Ah, you find it so, Mr. Lestrade," cried Gregson triumphantly. "I thought you had come to that conclusion. Have you managed to find the secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson?" "The secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson," said Lestrade gravely, "was murdered at Halliday's private hotel at 6 o'clock this morning."